Welcome back to Harbor. We're going to take a look at the worldwide war on drugs right now. I spent the weekend in Colombia, Cartagena, at one point moderating a discussion among world leaders, including President Obama, at the Summit of the Americas. I asked Colombian President Santos and President Obama about the future of the so-called drug war in this country. Specifically, should drugs be legalized here in this country in an attempt to put an end to the narco-terrorism in the South? You have a chance to sit next to President Obama now. Do you want to ask him about the ways you think the United States could help your country in the drug war?
Chris, ¿no tiene una pregunta un poco más fácil?
Don't you have a simpler question?
How can we improve North-South relations, generally speaking?
We have the obligation to see if we're doing the best that we can do, or if there are other alternatives that can be much more efficient. On one side, it can be to put all the consumers go to jail. The other extreme is legalization. On the middle ground, we may have more practical policies.
I think it is entirely legitimate to have a conversation about whether the laws in place are ones that are doing more harm than good in certain places. I personally, and my administration's position, is that legalization is not the answer. That, in fact, if you think about how it would end up operating, the capacity of a large-scale drug trade to dominate certain countries, if they were allowed to operate legally without any constraint, could be just as corrupting, if not more corrupting, than the status quo.
Just as corrupting or worse than the status quo. Kevin Sabet is a former senior advisor on drug policy for the Obama White House, and Ethan Nadelmann is the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance. Ethan, make the case, or Kevin rather, make the case for legalizing.
Well, I think legalization would just make our problems worse. I mean, we'd have more addicts. We'd be spending more in our healthcare system. Already, illegal drugs cost us $200 billion in terms of lost social costs. And our legal drugs, alcohol and tobacco, cost $400 billion of social costs. And we only get about $35 billion in revenue. So, the numbers don't add up for legalization. We also wouldn't be crippling the cartels if we legalized drugs. And that's because these cartels are dealing with guns, human trafficking, piracy, on and on. And it would be a small dent in their overall balance sheets, and we'd be instead creating addicts here and abroad.
Why do I hear when I was down there this weekend, I'm no expert, I was down there this weekend listening to people like Santos, the very impressive president of Colombia, and the others. They seem to think that what's going on up here, the vast consumption of illegal drugs up here, is killing those countries down there with weapons, with murder, with horror, and corruption. How do we respond to that by saying, we'll keep going the way we're going? We're going to keep fighting the so-called war on drugs.
Well, Chris, we shouldn't keep going the way we're going. That's also not the option. I think actually President Santos said it right, that on one extreme you have legalization. On the other, you have the old lock-em-up policies. But there's also, there are a lot of other policies in the middle that we can work on in terms of treatment. Our good friend Patrick Kennedy and Jim Ramstad fighting for addiction parity to make sure health insurance companies cover addiction like any other health illness. Looking at drug courts, Martin Sheen and Matthew Perry, big fans of drug courts, which essentially leverage the criminal justice system and the healthcare system together and make judges sort of intervene on an addict's life.
Okay.
That's the way to do it.
Let me try it. Let's hear the other side. Ethan, with the other side. It seems to me, Ethan Nadelmann, that we have kids making careers now starting when they're 18 as drug salesmen on the streets. That's their great business plan, to go out there and sell drugs in their neighborhoods. What would legalization do to that market, the illegal market?
Well, it would do the same thing that ending alcohol prohibition did to that market. I mean, let's face it, what you're seeing, Chris, in Mexico, Central America, other parts of Colombia and the region, it's like Chicago during the days of Al Capone and prohibition times 50. I mean, the crime, the violence, the empowerment of organized crime, the black markets, these are all the consequences of a failed prohibitionist policy. The presidents down there are smart enough to know not to say legalize everything. Building consensus, an emerging critical mass that we need to put all options on the table, including the decriminalization of drug possession, including legal regulation of drug markets, and everything as well. That's what's new.
Let me try.
President Obama said he's against legalization. Okay. Every president has said that.
Well, let me try the tricky question. 10 people could have a glass of wine, and maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 would become quickly addicted to alcohol. But I'm told that if you try crack cocaine, let me go to Kevin on this. If you try crack cocaine once, you're liable to be addicted.
Well, obviously, it depends on the person. I mean, we also don't want to overstate the case. But there's a high addiction rate with crack or methamphetamine. I mean, heroin, 1 in 4 users become addicted, and the rest, still become a drain in our life, even if they aren't, technically addicted. So the idea that we're going to wipe out these cartels just if we legalize tomorrow, alcohol prohibition was over a 13-year period, and they were wiped out, that underground market for that. Illegal drugs, over 100 years. They're operating on a host of other problems like guns and human trafficking and piracy. The idea that we're going to wipe them out is ludicrous. We can have a smarter policy, and we should. We should focus on drug courts, addiction as a healthcare problem, as a disease, as other people have said. But this idea of legalization, that is an extreme example. One point Ethan made about decriminalization, to make that distinction, I mean, decriminalization may actually even have a more perverse effect than legalization, because if we decriminalized, meaning if we kept the market intact but didn't have any sanction for users, you could have an increase in users, but you wouldn't even touch the market. So we're actually going to be giving more money to the cartel.
We don't have a minute. You react to that, Ethan.
You're already saying things that are not actually factually. Yeah, I mean, what you're hearing from Kevin Sabet is the same old drug war gobbledygook that we've heard for decades at this point.
You're going to
Kevin, hold off. Kevin, hold off, Kevin.
And new ideas. The evidence shows that decriminalizing drug possession will reduce the arrest of millions of poor people and people of color without increasing drug use. That's the evidence.
Well,
we also know that in the
alcohol.
United States, 50% of Americans now say it's time to legalize marijuana like alcohol. Okay,
Ethan,
that would be a
that if we did that,
effort in order in terms of reducing the black market. So what's
Ethan,
emerging right now, Kevin, stop. What's emerging right now is building on what President Cardoso of Brazil, Gaviria of Colombia, Zedillo of Mexico, many other distinguished leaders, not from the left, but from the center-right, are saying we need a new dialogue, a new debate. And what's going on
thank you. We're going to have you back again. I'm sure this debate will continue on here as well. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Kevin. Let me just tell you, those watching who find this debate important, 50% of Americans now favor legalization of marijuana use. 50%. So this is right on the edge. Now look at that convergence there on that chart. This is a hot debate of the future.